if we could take our seats, we'll start it in a moment. I see there's been some attrition. I hope that was associated with attendance at the Who concert. Okay. So let's see, this morning we have to kick off two activities. These are reviews of a couple of draft deliverables out of two of our committees, and we will in each case have a presentation, and then we will have a discussion of the material. So the first on the agenda is a discussion of the privacy evaluation methodology from the Privacy Committee, and Jim Elstey, I see, is already wending his way up to the stage. So come on up, and Jim will take us through it. And so Jim, I'll go ahead and ask you to just remain up here after you finish the presentation for a Q&A.
Is this on? Can you hear me? So apologies, but I'm going to step down and walk around while I do this because I can't see the workflows from up on the stage. So good morning. We're really pleased to have some time on the agenda to talk about the privacy evaluation methodology and to at least introduce both the process we're going to try and use as well as the criteria we're going to use for evaluation. We have about 20 minutes, and what I want to do is really tear through the process quickly so that Stuart can talk to you in a little more detail about the criteria, and then obviously take questions at the end. So first and foremost, I think it helps to frame this up, some of the principles we used in developing this methodology. Our goal is to be able to effectively evaluate privacy issues and risks in the work products that are being produced by the IDESG. In order to do that, we need some structure. We need a workflow that we can follow, and we need some criteria that we can apply in a consistent manner to all of these work products. We want to be able to provide support for the committees in this process. This is not just an exercise in, you guys do your work, give us your output, and then we'll let you know when we're done evaluating it. This is a very interactive methodology, and we have several points in the methodology where we can sit down, talk about issues, and resolve those issues before we reach what would be, in my opinion, an unfortunate conclusion of having to object to a deliverable. So our mandate for this methodology comes from the Rules of Association. We're obligated to create a privacy evaluation methodology. We are also obligated to have liaisons with your committees to provide support, to provide guidance on privacy issues. We have the responsibility of evaluating the work products of the IDESG, and we have a sanction that can be applied if there are privacy issues that remain unresolved in a work product. Now, I'd like to characterize that sanction for you. In my opinion, when we started in August, several people raised the question of the veto of the Privacy Committee. And I made some very explicit statements in every discussion I had that the word veto does not appear in any document. It wasn't any of the initial documents. It didn't appear in any of the documents we were producing. There was one point where, when we were developing our charter, somebody slipped the word veto in, and I was a little bit concerned about that, but we had that removed. But instead of having an absolute sanction to prevent a document from being approved, we have a sanction that I think, in my opinion, is actually worse. We have the ability to object to a document under the 5332 section, and there's a requirement for a supermajority vote to overrule that objection. And why I believe that's worse is that if we actually overrule a privacy objection, we have, in a very public manner, stated that we have privacy issues in a document, and we as an organization believe those privacy issues aren't worthy of recognition or addressing. And we'll have made that a public statement on our website, because our report and that work product will be posted. So I'm very concerned about the application of that formal objection in any but the most dire circumstances. So I don't want anybody to think that we believe that objection or that formal objection authority is anything but a course of last resort. So how are we going to avoid that? Well, we got a methodology that I think allows us to identify and resolve issues early in the process and in a way that's constructive and collaborative. I'm going to talk about basically 3 parts. Matter of fact, I'm going to point to the flow chart over here so folks can see. This is the first sort of step in the process, which is implementing our methodology. I'll just draw your attention to a couple things. First of all, we're going to make sure our liaisons are well trained in this methodology, that they understand the evaluation criteria, that they understand the application of this methodology, that they can be a resource for your committee in terms of applying that methodology. We then, after a certain amount of deliberation, came up with the phrase coaching committees. We are going to coach your committees on the application of this methodology. We're going to make sure that you have the support you need. We'd like to think that you will take an interest in the methodology, the criteria, try to understand how things are going to be evaluated to essentially self-evaluate, but we are certainly interested in supporting you in the application of the methodology. And then the other important point about our implementation is we see our criteria especially as a living document. Things are going to improve in that. We are going to learn things as we apply this methodology. We are going to have a process for continual evaluation and improvement of the methodology. And basically that's a feedback loop that says, provide us feedback. Do we need to update our methodology? If we do, we're going to go to a section of the workflow that allows us to apply those updates to the methodology and improve upon it. So this is the heart of the informal part of the process. And we've labeled this phase privacy engineering. And what we mean by privacy engineering is we want to build privacy into your deliverables. We want to make sure that privacy is a consideration as you are doing development. This workflow has essentially 3 phases to it, or 3 stages. This first phase, whoops, wrong button, Jim. This first phase is about identifying that a work product is under development. At the point in time where you propose a work product, you have a proposal on the table, your committee is going to engage in work, we want to identify that so we can start tracking that a proposal has been made and that a work product is under development. We have a body that we are going to form that's an evaluation subcommittee, ESC, and that evaluation subcommittee will be comprised of privacy experts who will serve as a backstop to the liaisons, help as a body to evaluate the privacy risks and issues and make sure that we have some of the best and brightest in our privacy community participating in these evaluations. The first thing we want to look at is, are there privacy implications in this work product? There are going to be some things that have absolutely no privacy implications at all, which are just, the example I've used is some kind of technical standard that has no relevance from a privacy perspective at all. But if there are privacy implications, we're going to make sure that we're aware of that and that we're looking at this work product. And then in this second stage, we have an iterative process of working together with your committee, the development team that's developing the work product, trying to identify issues and risks early in the process, communicating those to the committee, working to find resolutions informally during that development process, and tracking it through the development process until you reach that sort of final draft stage where you're ready to move that deliverable into the formal process for review and approval. And at that point, when you reach the final draft stage, we're going to make one last appeal to try and resolve any privacy issues informally. And this is, in my opinion, we have multiple opportunities during development, and then one last appeal informally to try and resolve these issues, to propose mitigating alternatives, to negotiate with you, to try and make sure that those issues get resolved. And then if we wind up, accepting those mitigating alternatives, you go back, redraft a bit, and then on we go to the formal process. Once we start the formal process, we start the clock and the time frames that we've enumerated in the methodology. So at some point, a formal work product is brought to us and submitted to the privacy committee. We're going to take a look at that to see, are there any unresolved privacy issues, or are there any other privacy implications that have previously been, not been considered or for some reason need to be addressed. I want to draw your attention to Workflow 2.4. Workflow 2.4 is what we like to refer to as the fast track. If you come through the beginnings of this process and there are no unresolved privacy issues, there are no additional privacy implications, we go to workflow 2.4, okay? If, however, there are unresolved issues or there are privacy implications, we go to 2.2, and this is the heart of our evaluation methodology process. First, we do a characterization of the work product. We're going to essentially dissect it along a life cycle methodology that Stuart will describe in a little more detail. We then do a detailed analysis of the privacy issues or risks that can be identified in that work product. And then, if we do have issues or risks identified, we're going to develop some mitigation alternatives to propose in the formal process. Once again, if there are no privacy issues or risks identified, off to workflow 2.4. The next stage of this is report generation and review. This is our last appeal to you to try and resolve these issues. We're going to generate our report, and they're going to deliver the report to the chair of the Privacy Committee, and the chair of the Privacy Committee will sit down and review this with the submitting committee chair. And we will talk about the privacy issues that have been unresolved. We will make sure that you understand what's in the report, what the issues are, how they've been articulated, and what mitigation alternatives we're proposing for those issues. One thing we will not do in this discussion is talk about whether or not we're going to have a formal objection. We're not going to try and use that as a stick to beat you about the head and shoulders to make you conform to these mitigating alternatives. This is where workflow 2.4 turns into a bad path, right? Because either you accept the mitigating alternatives and go back and revise your work product, in which case you go back to the beginnings of the process, or you decide you don't want to accept those mitigating alternatives, resolve the issues, and we go to the final stage of this, which is the outcome stage. I'm going to be very clear that there are 3 outcomes from any evaluation we do. The outcome we would like to draw your attention to is no privacy issues. If we assume that we've jumped here in 2.4 on a fast track, we have a test here that all privacy issues are resolved, the report will be no privacy issues, it will go to the Privacy Committee for approval, off to the plenary for approval, okay? If, however, there are unresolved privacy issues or risks, we will do a formal objection evaluation, and we will make a determination about whether those issues and risks are material enough to warrant a formal objection. So I want to make sure folks understand that we're not going to object over immaterial privacy issues. And I'll give you one example that I used in discussions because it's easy to envision a situation where we have, say, a standard. And that standard may have less than ideal privacy practices and may raise a privacy issue in our minds. But it's a standard that we didn't write, and we're not likely going to be able to change that standard. And that standard is widely adopted or widely used. That's the type of thing where we would note that there was an issue with that standard, but not object and stop the process, because we want to be able to continue the work of the IDESG. And then we have the infamous formal objection. And in those cases, we're going to make a formal objection. We're going to exercise the 5332 objection authority, and we're going to identify that we had multiple opportunities in the informal process and at least one opportunity in the formal process to try and resolve those issues, and we failed to do so. It will be our failure, and it will be your failure. I hope that we do not have to do that ever. We are going to be here to work collaboratively with you, to try and support you, to try and identify these issues clearly, to try and find mitigating alternatives that work for you, and to try and avoid at all costs producing reports that say anything other than no privacy issues. Let me talk about time frame. Sorry, we'll do questions. So those are our 3 alternatives. These are the 3 sort of outcomes of this. No privacy issues but no objection, and privacy issues and formal objection. So here are our time frames. We want this to be timely, but everybody here knows we're working in a volunteer organization, and trying to produce reports by committee is a somewhat daunting task. If you have no privacy issues in your work product, we will get this done in 30 days. That will give us a chance to make sure that those issues have been resolved in the informal process, that every concern is addressed, and that there are no issues to be essentially produced in a report. However, if there are issues, and we have to go through the detailed characterization, analysis, and develop mitigating alternatives, sit down, produce a report, sit down with the committee chair, try to negotiate the acceptance of those mitigating alternatives, support any conclusion we might have about formal objections, that's going to take us at least 90 days. And that 90 days incorporates enough time to have, multiple meetings of the evaluation subcommittee, discussions with the submitting committee, and get a document that can be approved by the privacy committee. So with that, that's the process. Now I want to turn it over to Stuart to talk about the evaluation criteria, which is the heart of how we're going to evaluate these things. Got it? Other way around.
Other way around? Okay, that makes more sense. Okay, thank you, Jim. So we have very carefully crafted these criteria to ensure that we instill the appropriate amount of fear and loathing into everybody. No, just kidding. And they include fair information practice principles, which, even if we were not mandated to include those, which we are, we would have chosen to include them because they're kind of the lingua franca of informational privacy. However, FIPS don't always catch everything. They don't always catch all the privacy problems. They don't always catch unforeseen situations. They don't necessarily lead you to all of the privacy concerns. And so we're enhancing this by including some defined potential privacy and civil liberties risks. The FIPS we're using are non-exclusive. They include those FIPS which were articulated in the 2011 NSTIC foundational document. And for those of you who don't realize, those were basically slightly massaged versions of the DHS FIPS. Excuse me. And we also thought it was appropriate to reference the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. But every set of FIPS out there is slightly different, and if we think that there's a particular feature of some particular FIPS that falls outside of these two, that will help illuminate an issue, then we might call upon that. For the defined potential privacy and security risks, we started with Dan Solov's privacy taxonomy. It's actually a taxonomy of privacy problems. For those of you who don't know, Dan Solov is a professor at GWU and is certainly, I think, viewed by most people as one of the most prominent privacy researchers and scholars working today. So we started with his taxonomy, and then we started massaging it and shaping it so that we had something which was a little more focused on the kinds of issues which we think we may end up having to deal with, although hopefully not. Going back to what I said about the FIPS, none of these criteria are intended to be absolutely exclusive. There's lots of good stuff out there which facilitates privacy analysis, and we're not going to say that we are not going to leverage anything else if the occasion calls for it. If depending on what we're looking at, if we think there's some other analytical framework or something out there which is going to illuminate the issue in a way which these things are not, then we're going to feel free to draw upon it. However, what I can very confidently promise you is that you will not hear anything from us along the lines of, well, we just don't like it. Okay? It just doesn't give us the warm fuzzies. And any concerns, any issues, any risks that we raise are going to be grounded in some kind of solid, concrete, analytical framework. They are not just going to pop out of thin air. And we recognize that not all of these criteria are going to be relevant in every instance. Every work product is going to be different. It's going to touch on certain aspects of privacy and not so much perhaps on other aspects. And none of us are interested in work for the sake of work. And so where criteria clearly are not going to help us get to the bottom of things, then we're not going to spend time focusing on them. So we've got an instrument, we've got a tool for facilitating this process, Privacy Evaluation Workbook. It's literally an Excel workbook. It's actually, most of the contents are guidance. The evaluation worksheet that's in this thing has three high-level headings going across the top. Characterization, analysis, mitigation, and compensating controls. Risk analysis and risk management processes vary greatly in their details. They vary greatly in how elaborate they are. But at the end of the day, they're all doing these three things. Aside, everything else aside, all of them have to do those three things. They have to characterize the target of the analysis. They have to describe it in some way. They have to have some kind of analysis process whereby risks are identified based on that characterization. And having identified those risks and their severity, they have to figure out what they're going to do about them. Okay? And so we decided to keep it simple. Personally, I wanted a 24-stage process, but I was outvoted, so we've just got the three. And then down the side, we've got information lifecycle stage. And we're breaking it up this way quite simply in order to break it up. This kind of thing can get complex very quickly. And so in order to keep things manageable, we're going to do all of this, the characterization, the analysis, the mitigation, based on whichever information lifecycle stage we're dealing with. By the way, in case you're wondering about PII creation as opposed to PII collection, that would come under processing. All right, so there's nothing particularly profound about this. As I said, it's simply a way of organizing the work and managing the complexity. All right, so let me talk a little bit more about each of these stages. So, characterization. You have to have a description of the target of analysis which is amenable to that analysis, which is going to kind of jibe with whatever analytical frameworks you happen to be using. And since we're worrying about privacy risk, privacy issues, this is how we're going to be characterizing work products. We need to understand the actors and their relationships that are involved either explicitly or implicitly in the work products, what types of personal information are involved, how they're intended to be used, what the flows are between the different actors, and also the legal and regulatory requirements that might apply to all of this stuff. Analysis. Well, as I've already indicated, we're going to be using FIPS. And also the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights was actually just a kind of particular type of FIPS. And we've also got these predefined privacy and civil liberties risks, which we'll also be drawing upon. Obviously, there are going to be legal and regulatory concerns, things that we have to ensure are actually being complied with. And of course, we have a catch-all, other privacy issues, because you never know. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. You never know, and so you simply have to have a bucket to catch the stuff that you weren't anticipating. Mitigation, compensating controls. Okay, typically when you've got a document out for formal comment, you send out a comment form, and it isn't enough for people to simply say, well, I don't like this, I don't like that. You typically require them to say, well, what do you propose to do about it? All right? And we feel the same responsibility. Right? We're not simply going to say, well, this is a problem. You need to figure out what to do about it. Come back and see us when you have. Instead, we're actually going to recommend one or more ways of potentially addressing that problem. Now, the committee might come back and say, well, that's just not going to work. That's not practical, or it's conflicting with this other thing. We've got to figure out another way. And that's fine. It's a recommendation. It's not an edict. But we do want to give people at least some ideas about things they could do to address whatever issues or whatever risks the evaluation has identified. And I want to emphasize that risk acceptance can be a valid resolution of a risk, okay? When you're doing risk management, it is not inherently illegitimate to decide, I'm going to accept that risk because the costs of mitigating it are just too extreme, or it's going to present inoperability issues, whatever. Or maybe there's some crucial trade-offs involved. Everybody agreeing that, okay, we're going to accept this risk, that's okay in principle. The key thing is all of this forces those decisions out into the open, all right? So instead of risk acceptance decisions or decisions to accept residual risk being kind of implicit and non-deliberative, they are explicit and deliberative. So everybody is clear about what is being decided and what the outcome is. All right, Jim, do you want me to do the summary, or do you want to?
I'll help. So,
And if you could do the summary from the podium so that
why don't you take that and have a seat, or Okay, so 20 minutes is a really quick sort of, pass at the privacy evaluation methodology. So I just want to hit on a couple points. Number one, we've talked about the process we're going to use for implementation, and I would reiterate that we'll have either with individual committees interactions where we can go into detail on the methodology, the criteria. We can answer your questions specifically for your committee. We'll also do some workshops that will be open to anyone to have the same sort of discussion, to really deep dive into this, ask questions, get feedback, help people understand, what it is we've created here. I want to reiterate the value proposition of the privacy engineering phase, which is the informal interaction with the privacy committee, with your liaison, to try and identify issues and resolve them informally and get them out of the way before we hit that formal stage. With regards to the formal stage, I would just reiterate two things, which is the three outcomes, no issues, the ideal outcome, issues with no objection, an okay outcome, and the worst outcome of issues with a formal objection. And then repeat the notion of the time frames, which is 30 days for a work product that has no issues associated with it, and 90 days for work products that do have issues. And Stuart, you're in the back, but so the criteria, once again, the process in a nutshell is characterize the work product, break it down, dissect it, be able to, use the life cycle and the different phases in that criteria to really dissect a work product, analyze that work product for issues using things like the FIPS, the CPBR, the risks, and then looking at mitigation strategies that we can share with you to try and find a happy compromise to any issues that have been identified. So with that, Stuart, you can't hide in the back while they ask questions, man. You got to come up here and take the, take the tomatoes and the, vegetables face on.
Okay, so thank you very much, and I guess we have a question from Brett.
Thank you. So speaking as someone who's not been participating in the privacy committee, and I'm not that familiar with the sausage making that took place to here, I just want to commend you. I think this is good, solid work, and I'm happy with what I see reported today. My questions are related to kind of looking at how we're going to apply this. So on one hand, you've got a 30 and 90 days, so you're setting some expectations. But I would ask that you consider, could you accelerate that if you had guaranteed resource support? So as we go into the Management Council meeting later today, we look at budgets and how to support the work of this group. It seems to me that there's a lot of work that might have to go into something, and if you're just banking on volunteers being there for you, I think it puts the rest of the work of the organization at risk. So I'd like you to think about what kind of contracted SME support maybe we could apply so that you could meet those targets and potentially even, consider those worst case targets.
Right. So I think the volunteer nature of our organization puts a variable into any time frames. Absolutely correct. Having resources that we could, essentially rely upon to do the work in a regular fashion, in a reliable fashion, would help that. The one thing that remains sort of a variable in the equation is getting it through committee approval. So we could shorten the time frames to the extent of producing the output, but then there's still the variable component of whether or not it takes, time for approval. But, our goal is to try and do this as quickly as possible. We think the 90-day window was essentially an assumption that it would fall between plenary sessions where, the bulk of business of the plenary would be conducted.
Brett has a follow-up.
Yeah.
Just a quick
Sorry,
follow-up.
could I,
Okay.
before you follow on, let me follow on. There's a certain element of this which is kind of mythical man-monthish. As someone who has done this type of stuff before, after a certain point, adding more bodies doesn't help. It takes a certain amount of time to grind through. Having said that, without doubt, the bulk of the work when doing this kind of thing tends to fall in the characterization stage. The analysis, it's actually sometimes quite surprising how relatively easily the analysis falls out if you've got a solid characterization. And you also have to make sure that it's a solid characterization because otherwise you've got garbage in, garbage out. Characterization is probably the most mechanical part of this process. And so if there was paid support, paid resources which would be able to do the bulk of the characterization work, then that could potentially significantly shorten timelines.
Great, thank you. So the other quick follow-up is just what happens if you don't get an agreement in the 90 days? Is the 90 days there as a, look, that's how much time you're giving yourselves, so a non-decision becomes a thumbs up?
So I wouldn't make the default a thumbs up if we failed to meet the timeline. What I would suggest is that two things. One, the timelines are now based on sort of zero historical information in terms of what it really takes to do this, okay? In practice, we'll find out whether those estimates are good estimates or not. There may be exceptional cases where we need to go beyond that 90 days, but those will be cases where the issues are significant or complex or otherwise require a more elaborate articulation. So what I would say is that these are our benchmarks that we're shooting for, and that if we have an exceptional circumstance or for some reason can't meet those benchmarks, we will make it clear to both the committees, the Management Council, and the plenary why we're unable to meet that and ask for the indulgence of those bodies if, in fact, it's because of the complexity of the work product or the analysis that's going on and not some sort of structural failure in our ability to deliver. I believe in talking with members of the Privacy Committee that they are very committed to executing on this methodology as efficiently as possible. We have a current evaluation in flight that is our alpha evaluation. It's a little bit different than what we anticipate having to do for work products of the IDESG, but it is taking a little bit longer than we anticipated, mostly because it's difficult to get people together to characterize, as Stuart says, characterize issues and to start to refine that into something that's a deliverable in an organization that meets voluntarily once every week. I mean, we literally have a team that's meeting once a week to do the analysis. They're working in between the meetings to try and actually do the cranking on the sausage machine. And we're making progress, but it's not necessarily as fast as we'd like. I suspect that as we start to do more of these, efficiency will improve, just the nature of improving on that process. And if we find that there are structural defects, we can try to identify what those are and correct them. But we'd love to have a budget, Brett, so,
Yeah, and to Stuart's point for a moment, I think Brett's comment about resources, the mythical man months notwithstanding, the difference between 0 and 1 resources is much more important than the difference between 1 and 2. I think Tony has a question. Just a minute.
Yeah. So does this process apply to IDESG itself?
Oh, we're going to open up that can of worms this morning.
Yeah.
So
well, it's a problem, right? If you're going to apply it to the deliverables that are going on within the IDESG, I would hope that the tools and efforts of the IDESG would also go through this same process.
I think it's a fair point. And my sense is that Number one, we're all investing our time and effort in the IDESG and want to see it be successful. Two is applying the privacy methodology and trying to evaluate any privacy issues is in the best interest of the IDESG as an organization. So I think it's very rational to assume that we would want to do that. And I think in part why we want to do that is to be exemplars of these privacy practices that we espouse. And if our website, for instance, or the practices of the IDESG are less than ideal, I think it creates a cognitive dissonance for people, right? You say you want privacy-enhancing, identity solutions, and yet you don't follow good privacy practices. So I think it's fair game. I think we're being very sort of circumspect about the notion of our formal authority to do that versus just being, good neighbors and trying to help out under a sort of good faith approach to this. And I'll disclose that our alpha evaluation is the IDESG website. We've evaluated the privacy policy in terms of services that were drafted, and we've produced some output for that. We're currently evaluating some of the functions on the website to see what the privacy implications are, and we think it's in the best interest of the organization. So that's sort of my position. The Privacy Committee has supported that. I'd love to hear, different opinions than that, but...
Thanks. Are there other questions or comments on the privacy evaluation methodology? So, Jim, if people go through the detailed document and wish to engage with the Privacy Committee on comments on it, can you reiterate how to do that? So, a couple things. One, we've released version 1.0, and anyone who's spent any time in IT knows what 1.0 means. It means tomorrow we start work on version 2.0. We anticipate some improvements and some, through either actually applying the methodology and learning lessons or input and feedback from members of the IDESG to find things that could be improved. I think in conjunction with what I've already spoken about, which is doing these workshops, trying to work individually with the groups. We'd like to start soliciting feedback. I think we can do a couple of things. One, we can circulate or produce a feedback form that allow you to actually characterize feedback, tell us what part of the methodology you're commenting on. Two is I think once we've collected some feedback, we'll in our evaluation methodology development team take a look at that, try to synthesize it down into some consistent prioritized recommendations, and then socialize those for review. And Stuart, I'll let you speak to it too, because you may have gotten off the hook for vice chair, but you haven't gotten off the hook for the methodology development team. And so before Stuart answers that, the cards and letters go to him? Yes. Okay. Stuart Shapiro.
Yes, thank you so much. The price of fame. I mean, I agree with, I support everything that Jim has said, and I'll just emphasize, feedback is appreciated. Everybody in this room has a stake in this process, and you can only do so much kind of cloistered, often in the privacy SME's monk cell, trying to generate this stuff. So we are very happy to receive any and all comments, and in particular happy to consider suggestions for ways that this can be improved.
So we'll take one more question and comment, and then we'll move on to Kathy Tilton.
My name is Sitaram Durba from Cable Labs. This is probably not a specific question for privacy, but in general, I think that we are going towards a path of coming up with these guidelines and maybe certification by IDESG itself. Mm-hmm. I was just wondering how possible it is for us, or this group of people, to be able to come up with all kinds of scenarios and evaluation methodologies for all types. Maybe a medical field has a meaning of level 4 privacy, and in a marketplace outside it's a different meaning. So how can we go about having this all-encompassing set of guidelines for all the verticals? Right. That's a fairly complicated question, because ultimately
the IDESG and the Identity Ecosystem Framework are going to define those constructs. And within those constructs, what we're hoping to do by applying the privacy methodology to our work products is ensure that that privacy component is baked in. I think in many respects, our methodology reflects, you know, the best and most reliable external sources of privacy criteria, so that we're not, you know, creating some sort of obscure, you know, privacy result. We're going to be creating privacy results that are in line with current practice and the expectation that we're going to have privacy-enhancing solutions. The sort of leap beyond that of saying here is specific, you know, privacy evaluation criteria in the components of the IEF, I think is something we have to examine as we're building the framework. So Colin Suter touched on it yesterday with the security methodology, and the distinction that I heard was less of a methodology for evaluating the security in IDESG work products, more of a methodology for evaluating the security of the components of the IEF. I think we need that. I think that, you know, as you look at something like accreditation, you need to be able to say, these are the things we're using to evaluate the application of accreditation to a given provider. So ultimately, if it doesn't manifest in the components that are being developed, and we hope it does, then we'll have to essentially build that criteria as a separate component of the IEF. But it's a point well taken, but I think a fairly complex problem that's going to come out of the work that we're doing as a group here to identify that framework and the components of it.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim.
Thanks for all the
Stuart.
time, folks.
So the bad news is we're a little behind schedule. The good news is that the next session isn't going to take an hour and a half, and so you'll get to listen to people more interesting than me instead of me. So we'll give Kathy the time that she needs to go through the use case development methodology. We'll push the break back a little bit, and we will take the time out of the next session. Thanks for returning the stolen microphone there, Jim. Okay, so next up is Kathy Tilton, who is going to talk to us about use case development. Kathy, thank you. Take it away.
I can't see the screen myself. Okay, so I'll have to look at it at an angle. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've done so far with the use cases and what our plans are going forward. And not to insult you about what is a use case, but there are that means a lot of different things to different people. Whether you're an engineer, it means one thing. Software, even difference between software and systems engineers, it means different things. But then when you start talking about business or system owners, users, and other species, it means different things. So for purposes of our discussion, I'm going to use the definition that's shown there, because I personally like it. So Tony Nadlin asked an interesting question yesterday, and that was, why are we doing use cases? Why are they relevant to the work of the IDESG? And so I thought about that a little bit and came up with what you see on the screen there. I think it is the basis for the development of much of our other work products within the IDESG. It provides the context for those work products. It's also a method of eliciting requirements. As you go through those use cases, that's where you identify requirements. It helps us to define the problem that we're trying to solve, and to quote Dave Temeshuk from yesterday, it helps us to determine commonalities so as to be able to design services. And the bottom line is that it will be a guide to our collective efforts and to keep us aligned so that the various silos and groups and committees that make up the IDESG aren't going off in different directions, but we're all have an agreed set of use cases that we're working with. Okay, so there's questions about levels of use cases. At the high-level use case, you're really talking more about what and why, as opposed to the low-level use cases, which get into more of the hows. And so our target is I would call the scenario level, which is the what and why level. We had previously called that functional use cases or business use cases, and people didn't like either one of those terms. So I'm sure somebody will dislike this term as well, but that's what I'm using at the moment. So once we define these high-level use cases, it's possible then to define progressively lower-level use cases as needed. And those lower levels may be specific to particular focus areas. So, for example, privacy, security, user experience. And what has been done so far? We've developed a use case template, drafted just an initial list of potential use cases. We've began to identify sources of existing use cases. We've generated a couple sample use cases, and we've begun the collection effort. You heard yesterday from the Finance Committee about some use cases that they've done, and so I just really commend them for that. This is actually a tag team presentation, so I'm going to call up Scott Shorter to tell you a little bit more about what we've done. Scott is the lead for our ad hoc group on use cases.
I can see these. I'm sorry for not having all of this in the slides. They'll get distributed. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Sorry, this didn't make it into the slides. You'll get an update with at least a graphic of these or something. This is now IDESG IPR, so don't worry. This was just a little mapping I did a second ago, thinking about how the committees might map to the levels of use cases that we've defined. The component level use case is about devices interacting with each other, and that's really about communicating standards. Users are humans and have concerns like privacy and user experience, as well as communication and outreach and training and many things that humans need. In my slide, system in Kathy-like scenario, and we can go with that. Policy, things that happen to organizations like policies and accreditation processes. And then up at the strategic ecosystem level, perhaps trust frameworks, perhaps the IDESG itself, the IEF, the IEF framework. We're clarifying the models at this level still. So, okay, I need to learn to do that. Okay, so let me speak to the slides, and then I'll speak to the rest of that. We do have a use case template. It's got a lot of fields, probably too many to make this a process of gathering lots of use cases, which we kind of want to do, then call out the commonalities, find what everybody's interested in, and try to get everybody's input into the same representation of these common use cases. So these are things we can certainly capture. These fields up on the screen. Pretty soon we may have some kind of collaboration platform, and I'll be able to edit and view the same set. So that'll be nice. This is definitions of the fields, which I will not bore anybody with today. I have to remember that some of you were at a concert last night, so maybe I should really try to speak up. We do have some terms that we've defined. This isn't really a training session on use cases, so I don't even want to speak to the slides very much. But here's a representation of a simple identity ecosystem use case involving delegation of credentials to a service provider for access to someone's data through a third-party service. So I don't claim that we've got it right. There's even no requirements there so far, but this is a scenario that we know is out there today, and I'm sure a lot of stakeholders could have something to say to what we have there. So we look forward to developing this and other use cases. Okay, we have a methodology. What? Time? Do you want to speak to these? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let me just throw in a little humor for those that have had too much serious time here. I'll do it quickly. New use cases. I was a little sad about not going to the concert, so I want to talk about lyrical use cases. Preferably, every use case is named after a song, and if you get higher marks for if it's from a Who song. Okay, this is a little Eminem reference, actually, but there are a few Scott Shorters in the world. I'm this one. The use case is name matching. It happens to everybody. Thank you, Kathy. Patient identity is going to happen to almost all of us. Can you see the real me, doctor? Just a little security awareness training break for all of us. I hope you remembered your badge so we can know. Who are you? Population, everyone. Just a moment. Thank you, Kalia, for talking about population of use cases, because that isn't something that had been contributed before. Okay, getting into the obscure discography now. The implications of mobility on geolocation privacy and other concerns. So, Stuart, if geolocation privacy isn't in your methodology yet, please consider this a free contribution. Oh, I'm sorry. The song is I'm Mobile, and the lyric is, no offense to the NPO or anyone else, watch the police and the taxman miss me, I'm mobile. Okay, there's a song, I'm a Boy, I don't know what album it's from. This is about attribute claims and who can make them. If you know the song well, his mom actually does not agree and dresses him like a girl. So how do you decide? Conflict resolution, privacy. And finally, talking about our generation involves reputation management as well as perhaps demographic effects on different use case populations. I'm sorry, people do try to put us down just because we get around. I can't sing, so I just wanted people to read them on there. Okay, and this was just my notes, so thank you. Kathy? Okay.
Scott, did you take the clicker?
It's on the floor.
On the floor.
Stage left.
Thanks. Okay, so what is the approach that we use to develop these use cases besides scouring the internet for lyrics? We've alluded to a collection phase. That's the phase we're kind of in now, where we're going out and just seeking inputs on a variety of use cases. There's a need to filter those and then to analyze and abstract from those, and then to actually create a deliverable set. You notice I have version 1 there. That's because we see this as an ongoing effort, but we're going to need to have deliverables at various points along the way. So this is a collaborative effort. We're looking at methods and ways that we can collaborate. This is just a chart that shows how both the steward of the use cases, which is the Standards Coordination Committee, and the rest of the world would contribute using the tools that we have at our disposal. Thank you. So where do use cases come from? Well, there are existing sources, so you know there's use cases that are already documented in the identity space, for example, by NIST and OASIS. Those are certainly places that we can go to pull out appropriate use cases. But there are also use cases that come from the stakeholders and stakeholder representatives, and that, of course, is you all. How are they to be developed? We had a joint meeting last night regarding use cases was one topic. Unfortunately, we ran out of time and didn't get to actually come to any kind of formal agreement on what that process is. But we did have multiple suggestions for how we would go about doing that. One is we already have an ad hoc group. That ad hoc group can continue to meet and work on them. Each committee could create their top 3 use cases. So, for example, just as the Financial Committee has done, we would challenge each of you committees to develop a set of use cases. So we're not asking for you to go off and develop 100 use cases, but if you could just pick your top 3 most highest priority, most relevant use cases, that would be a great input for us. We also talked about continuing the joint meetings that we had last night and working through some of the process that way. We're also, of course, going to leverage the wiki as soon as it becomes available, and that will provide a means for anybody within the IDESG to contribute use cases and also to review and comment on use cases that get posted. There was a suggestion that we have distributed small group sessions where the groups would, maybe a group of 10 or less people would work together on sets of use cases. For example, and there was also talk about an analyst group. One of the Management Council delegates suggested that it may be useful also for those delegates to go back to their stakeholder groups and solicit contributions that way as well. So in terms of a timeline, we did discuss this yesterday. I have a big caveat on the bottom that what I've put on the screen was not agreed by the group last night. It has not been totally socialized, so it's really more of a proposal at this point than a definitive way forward. But there was consensus that we need to set some goals and dates for ourselves. And so I tried to synthesize the discussion and come up with such a proposal. And so the goal I would like to make is that within 9 months, we have an initial draft set of use cases. 9 months being the term that we've been bandying about for our news releases, right? And so what would it take for us to get there? The initial star is us today. So that gives us, in the initial 3 months of that, 3 months being the time between now and our next plenary, we would hope to have the wiki launched. I understand that that's imminent, so we're really anxious to have that available to us. And so there's an effort to do the wiki design and then to begin populating the wiki. We do have some use cases now that we can populate it with, but we'll continue that collection effort from now until the 1st of April. So what does that 1st of April mean? Date mean to you? It means that as you go off in your groups and or individually or to your stakeholder groups, we'd like you to have your use cases, your candidate use cases into us by the 1st of April. After that, you can continue to submit use cases. We will just not consider them for this first deliverable. What does that take? It means that we're going to have some kind of criteria by which we will select the use cases and then to be able to apply a filter. And then we're also proposing a workshop at the next plenary in May. So that proposed May workshop, our desired outcome for that workshop would be to agree a set of use cases for analysis. So the use cases would not be completely analyzed at that time, but what we would do is review the filter set of use cases, apply the criteria, and work on refining those use cases. So, this would be a roll your sleeves up kind of workshop. And the preconditions are that we'd have to agree that set of criteria, and the committees, plenary members submit candidate use cases by the 1 April deadline. Now, that's a proposal for the workshop. We'd really be interested in your feedback on that to see is that are there other things we may want to address at that workshop? Okay, I see 2 hands. I think Kalia.
So we'll
and 3.
Run the microphone around.
So, as I recall, at the last plenary, we did a group brainstorming, a visioning exercise, and there was an amazing spreadsheet that came out of that. I'd like to see some of the available resources of staff to extract one-sentence use cases from that list, if that's possible, as a good starting point of what's already been put forward into this fora. I'm partly, I get a little bit worried that we're going to have a set of use cases 9 months from now. I think there's enough circulating in this, the many fora that we all participate in, and this fora itself, to have, some set that we might pick some action to form groups to solve them for within a month and have some progress by the time of the next plenary.
Okay.
So Kathy, if you want to respond, then I've got 2 more people in queue.
The only response I have is thank you for the input. And I had actually originally put 6 months in there. And I am caught between trying to be very action-oriented and aggressive towards the schedule, and then trying to insert some level of reality into what people's time commitments are and availability to support the effort.
So just two quick comments on that. So Kathy, on the point of practicality and resources, is there an individual human being named as the lead for this effort?
Scott is the chair of our ad hoc group.
Okay. And the second comment is April 1st isn't a good day for a deadline, maybe the 2nd. David is next, and then we'll go over there.
I did review the slides, but not in light of this morning's presentations. I think it's good to have a 3-month deadline in case we need 90 days for our privacy evaluation.
Thank you, and thank you, Kathy, for presenting this use case work plan. I was part of the discussion last night, and I thought that was very helpful. In terms of the schedule, as use cases are submitted, the slide that you presented earlier, where what use cases are used for is to determine implementation requirements for those use cases. So as use cases are being submitted now, starting in February, through up until the April period with targeting the workshop, those can be analyzed to determine requirements from or derive requirements from those use cases upon submission. So it doesn't have to be sequential like that. It can be analyzed to determine implementation requirements and potential functional requirements that would satisfy those as they're submitted.
Okay.
Kathy, would you like to respond to that before the next comment?
Nope, I appreciate that. The only hesitation I would have at all is that if we haven't determined any criteria associated with looking at those use cases, then we might be expending effort on a use case that ultimately doesn't make it into our set that we're targeting.
So the gist of my question is already covered by David's question. With that, I would like to request specifically, just to be clear, articulate the goal, wording of the goal. When you say by the end of this year about these use cases, I hope it is not just finishing collecting, documenting the use case, but rather completion of that filtering or analysis, which would bring out or derive the requirements into something that can be the basis for toward design of solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenny. That actually would be the goal, because in the first 3 months, if we can agree with the 10 set, the top 10 are, then the intent would be to take the rest of that time to do that analysis. And of course, that does require, as I mentioned, an analysis team. And so we would be looking to form a group to take on that task.
So, sure. Hi, Kim Little. The discussion that we had last night was really great about having a deadline for the first phase as we keep bringing things in. And I just want to make sure that we also, you had a slide that had the collection phase and then the filter. And I think it should be collection and then categorize. And I don't know if I would limit it to 3. I think that I think it's noble to think that we're going to have a bunch, that come in and you have to limit to 3. But I think that, keep it open. If one group has 12, let them bring them in, because then as we start to then group them, we might find something that we've left out and then filter. So I just wouldn't put that cap on 3 in the beginning.
Okay, and I didn't mean that to be a limit. I was just trying to say that, if you could get us 3, I'd be happy. Yeah.
So Daza is next. Daza, say your name so that the cameraman can catch you on screen.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Daza Greenwood from MIT. And I was at the meeting last night. It was great. And I encourage you to continue doing the use cases. And then some feedback on how this could be most useful, I think, is the use cases, as you were saying, it sounds like one of the uses of doing this is to develop what people's ideas are of what we would be doing within the IDESG generally to some extent. And we can do that through asking what their use cases are. That's not a bad way. It's not the only way within the IDESG that we're, people are percolating up what we might do. And so I would say something important to connect is the process as we crisp up like the definition of the identity ecosystem framework, as we crisp up whether or how we're doing accreditation and certification for issuance of a trust mark on a trust framework, for example, or maybe other services. And then there's some other things people have mentioned that we could do that plausibly we could. I'd say the first order question to get together on is to develop, I'd say at that scenario level on your slide, an initial statement of what we think the target is in terms of relevance to the IDESG. Like one scenario is it's a trust framework that's applying for and being issued an IDESG trust mark for a B2B identity federation. That's a scenario that tells us some things where we can see the relevance of some of these use cases to it or irrelevance or how they cluster and play out. And there's many other scenarios. So I guess the coolest thing I saw on your slides was the invitation. I think you said the challenge, which is even more scintillating, but to have all of the committees provide through a use case, because now you're really leveraging committees and some ideas. And doubtless we'll see different levels of abstraction and assumptions about what the use cases are supposed to talk about, but now at least we have people, within our existing structures to begin a conversation and follow on meetings to, have dialogues and figure out what we're doing. So I guess in closing, I would say I hope that we can actually follow up on one offer last night, which was a joint meeting with standards and accreditation and certification and trust framework joint group to crisp up at least one anchor point of within the IDESG, something that we should be doing, in this case with putting a trust mark on a trust framework, and see, can we say that as a scenario and begin to see what use cases are relevant or not relevant to that, and then keep iterating this with respect to what IDESG is doing, and therefore understanding what is and isn't salient.
So we're really happy to work with any and all of the committees jointly. I'd also say that in the ad hoc group, it may be useful for each of the committees to identify one person on their committees to sit on that use case ad hoc group. So maybe I'll throw that out as a second challenge as well, because that's your opportunity to really be more directly involved with the work.
So we have another comment over here on the other side of the room, trying to get as many whip pans in as possible to keep things visually interesting for the audience.
Okay, Bob, before we do that, I just wanted to mention, based on Daz's comment, I hadn't actually got through all the slides yet, but so some of the things he was talking about have to do with the criteria that we would apply. And so we're looking at, what would we prioritize? We talk about what level we're looking for, the relevance comment, and the cross-section. We'd be looking for a cross-section, a good cross-section of different types of use cases. And so anyway, I just want to point that out.
Thanks, Kathy. So Colin Suter with Deloitte supporting the NPO. Speaking, I guess, in support of at least 3 of the last 5 comments, I think that it's noteworthy that the joint meeting last night that we put together, so first of all, it was meant to be inclusive of many other committees. We suggested security and standards, but it opened to other committees. And I think at one point, perhaps 2 plenaries ago, we talked about maybe having 2 or 3 representatives from each committee attending such a venue. But the agenda for last night, and there was a lot of material, and it was hard to get through all the 3 different parts. I think it's noteworthy to look at, it was taxonomy, use cases, and functional model. And to the point I think David was making, it really is that, is one of the primary purposes of use cases to distill what is to be the functional model and hopefully break out some of the concepts around which taxonomy can be developed. So I guess my point is that I think it's important to continue that dialogue, but from the perspective of having all three of those fire together, because if they become disengaged, then I think it becomes a bit problematic. So perhaps that's one of the most, and as David I think was alluding to, early work in terms of distilling out the functional requirements that can build out the model. Certainly from the Security Committee's perspective, it's hard for us to come up with an evaluation methodology when the functional model is not in place.
Thank you. I actually appreciate both you and Daza mentioning those interdependencies, because they are quite interdependent. For example, if you can identify the elements of the ecosystem, those may become actors in the use case, and vice versa. The use cases may identify additional components that we haven't considered as we're developing that functional model. And of course, the terminology link is obvious.
So let's give Kathy a little bit of time to get through the last of her slides, and then we'll take one or two more questions when she's done.
Okay. Well, the only other thing, actually, I only have two more slides. But so how are we going to do that? Well, of course, we're going to solicit inputs, and then this is for the criteria, defining the criteria, and then maybe have a joint meeting to review and define what that criteria is. And so between now and the May workshop, what do we need to do? We need to get the wiki set up and operational. We need to continue collection. We need to agree the criteria. We need to do some detailed workshop planning. So, right now the workshop is more conceptual in nature than anything else. So we need to define specifically the content and the processes that we're going to use. And what we need from you, from the committees. We need you to work with us on the above, and you as individuals, we need you to work with us on the above. So that's it.
Hey, Kathy. Sorry, I just wanted to bring attention to the question that we have on the chat.
I can't see it.
Yeah, I'll read it. Are use cases being solicited from the committees only or from the general membership, and how are they to be submitted?
Thank you. We're soliciting from committees, from stakeholder groups, from individual IDESG members. Once the wiki is up, that will be the method for submitting either use cases or comments on the use cases. Until then, they can be submitted directly to Scott Shorter, and he'll take care of that.
Thank you. So, Kathy, 2 points. One, has the committee already decided to accept use cases in a different form, and one that I would recommend that is kind of the hot new trend in system development anyway, but also maps to a lot of what we've heard in trying to be, citizen and business friendly in our language, is agile user stories used in the agile development process that a lot of us are familiar with, and anyone who's not familiar is pretty easy to get up to speed. So would you accept use cases under the agile user story MO?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, and I had meant to say that the template is our preferred form, just because it makes processing them a little bit easier. Makes some commonality, but we'll accept them in any form that we can get them. If they're on the back of a piece of toilet paper, we'll take them. But definitely, something like that would be accepted.
Okay, and the second point is, can you clarify that the role that you're playing, that the committee plays as being the steward of use cases in filtering and doing the yeoman's work, is in service of the plenary, and the committee will or will not, I just want clarity for everybody, make decisions about what is in or out, or that you would consolidate, you do prioritization discussions, but you would just report that without any decision back to plenary and let plenary decide what's in and out.
So I almost included another slide which kind of talked more to the overall process for how things are done. I wish I had now. We have this collection process where we're doing kind of an inventory function, and we're doing that for all of the these IDESG-wide things that we're doing. So we're doing a standards inventory, we're doing a terminology inventory, we're doing a use case inventory. And so that's one path. And then there's the other path, which is now what is the process for creating a formal deliverable? And so I apologize, I don't have it up there, but we have identified that path, and we are not looking to be a gatekeeper on those or to just publish things unilaterally. That is obviously something, all of these efforts that we are just this facilitator or steward for would go through a process where the plenary or MC, or I'm not sure what the exact process is. I put one on the chart that I think is the one that we're using, but it would, no, we would not make those decisions unilaterally.
I think we have another comment here. Stand up and say your name for the camera.
Sure, Dan Schutz of the Financial Group. We had discussed in a lot of different joint meetings and so forth that besides just documenting the case, the use cases, there'd be a whole series of analyses on it. I mean, we heard this morning about a privacy analysis, for example, and in the financial services area, we were talking about some business and risk assessment analyses in conjunction with the security and the legal, and there would be other analyses like that, I am sure. So I would suggest that besides just documenting the use cases and getting them up there without filter, we also would have some of those kinds of things as companions to them, and that would help us in our deliberations in the plenary.
That's a great point. Laura, could you bring the slides back up, or whoever's got the slides? I was just going to point out that there's actually two types of analysis. The analysis that I was talking about initially was really to look at the use cases and try to identify commonalities and abstract those use cases to come up with the final set. But as Dan pointed out, there is another analysis that has to do with once you have kind of the basic functional use case, now you want to look at that from those various aspects. And so when I was talking about lower levels that have a specific focus, I mentioned a couple of them there, but certainly those other ones that Dan mentioned would be appropriate as well. And so absolutely, we would expect that to happen.
We have a couple of more comments here. Just a minute. Those lights are bright. Okay, I'm going to go to you first, and if you could show your face and name to the camera.
Hi, George Dobbs. I was just wondering if you could comment on where the use cases fit in the bigger picture in terms of a system development life cycle. It sort of sounds like this is you're accumulating use cases and getting them in good order, and then something else will happen.
Thank you. So, if you think about my background's in systems engineering, and so looking at it from a systems engineering and life cycle aspect, obviously this is one of the early stage analyses that would be done. And so the whole idea is to then, once you have those use cases, as we're working through the other aspects, maybe not sequentially, but even in parallel, as has been suggested, what we're looking to do is to elicit and derive requirements from these use cases that then would inform, the other work that's ongoing. And we, like I said, we don't expect this to be static. We expect this to be an ongoing effort, because there's no way that we're going to, within the first 3 months, identify every possible use case. And we know that there's new use cases evolving every day. And so we do expect this to be ongoing.
I was just going to say, along the lines of creating accessibility, it may be worth just putting up a web form on the Drupal site and going to some of the different groups which we discussed yesterday in the outreach committee and saying, could you tell us stories about how identity works for you today and how you want it to work differently in the future? I really think unless we have some normal person friendly way for people to interact with this institution we are going to paint ourselves in a corner and have low levels of public legitimacy for the end outcomes, which is why I keep bringing it up, and no filling out a form with those 10 different things is in it, and just saying if you send us an email or thing. We actually have to go and talk to people and invite leaders of other communities, of different religious groups. We have to go to the transgender community. We have to go to the rainbow that is America and the people who live here and ask them. We have to go to immigrant communities. We have to get illegal, undocumented immigrants use cases in here. We have to. And now is the time to have a proactive strategy, leverage the resources of the MPO and Deloitte, and go knock on some advocacy doors in D.C. and get some real use cases.
So, Clea, thank you for that. I think if we don't get the wiki up especially, the Drupal form is a good idea. But even after we get the wiki, it may be a good idea, because my understanding is on the wiki that you have to have an IDESG federated identity to provide input, whereas if we had it on the public space, that would allow us to take inputs in from non-members. And so I think that might be a policy issue we need to talk about, but on the surface it appears
So
reasonable.
that's half an answer to Kalia's question. By the way, I have about 5 people in the landing pattern here. But the other half of Kalia's question is, I think what she's saying is that we cannot just sit back and issue an invitation and then wait for people to send us things. I think what she's saying is that we need an active outreach program to certain communities who we know have interests but who haven't engaged with us. So we'll have to talk about how to manage that outreach, and I think Peter Brown may have some input into that.
Okay. And thank you for that. I agree. On the chart, the collaboration chart, I didn't know a better word. I just put advertise. That I had meant that to be more of the outreach effort. But I agree.
Okay.
Hi, this is Abby, Bank of America. I wonder how would you combine these use cases and how they relate to the current pilots?
To the what, Abby?
To the current funded pilots, the projects that are going. I think we already have mechanism. There are pilots going out there, some people doing some real deployment in theory. So how are we going to get that experience back to the use cases?
Okay, thanks, Abby. That's a good thought, and it actually did come up. I didn't make it onto my chart because I just forgot. But there are use cases being piloted, and that's a good candidate source of use cases as well.
Kim, next.
So I kind of want to go back to Kalia's comment, and the reason why I recommended that we have the stakeholder groups also be active in actually gathering the use cases. And so I think that part of the responsibility then of the stakeholder representatives that are part of the management council would be to get that additional feedback from those who obviously already have been identified to be a part of the IDESG, which all those people necessarily don't participate in the plenary sessions, and maybe don't really have a spot today necessarily on a working group. So that's a great way to get people to share feedback that they may already have. And then I think that the need to be able to reach out past the people who have already identified who might fit in your stakeholder group is all of our responsibility still. So, Kalia, I kind of think that some of that should happen from the stakeholder representative standpoint, but then we do have a big, gap that we will work with the communications and outreach organization.
Thanks, Kim. And for those of you on camera, that was Kim Little from LexisNexis. Brett,
Thanks, I appreciate that. And I did actually thought of something else I wanted to respond to with Kalia, and that had to do with the use cases being documenting some existing use cases that exist today versus future use cases, things that we would like to enable with online trust.
So. Again, I just want to remind Kalia's context. I would put context around Kalia's comments. So she's the elected delegate for a consumer advocacy stakeholder group, right? So that's why we hope that she keeps saying what she's saying and drive us to action. I just don't think that it's in the scope of a standards committee to do consumer, outreach and advocacy to collect their issues. But it is the job of this organization. And I think at the Management Council, we'll figure out how to do that effectively.
Thank you. We appreciate the help.
And another comment?
Just a thought along the lines of what we've been hearing. I don't know what people think, but I think it might be a useful product if, when we've got the use cases defined, not in great detail, if we had some sort of, say, outreach or survey or going out to the general public in terms of what they thought of those use cases and whether they would find that of value or whether they'd be concerned about privacy or whatever other things they'd like to say about them, that might be a useful product for us to see.
So just to clarify, Dan, you're saying once we come up with our 10 to try to use those to elicit additional feedback? Okay.
We have 3 comments on this side of the room first here. Oh, ouch. And please say your name for the camera.
Graham Whitehead from NASPO. Kathy, you know well my interest in having misuse cases also identified. I personally spent a lot of my lifetime thinking about understanding organized criminal groups. They are going to make good use, of whatever we create here. The Hells Angels will find a way to legitimize themselves. They will get background checks done if there's attribute suitability assessments. What they're looking for, of course, is failures of background checks. They're not going to enroll someone in their organization who's clean. And so what I would like to suggest, Kathy, is that not only do people formulate sort of positive use cases, but some negative ones as well to take into account the bad guys. That's my suggestion.
Thanks, Graham. We'll include that in our cross-section.
Judith Fleener. I just wanted to share some stuff we talked about yesterday in the Communications and Outreach Committee. And we looked at communication and outreach in a way where if you think of it as 3 columns, first there's the pitch of here's what we're doing, this is what we're trying to find out, and what's in it for you. And in that, if someone's interested then in submitting a use case, there's a middle part, which is the community building part. And in the community building part, what that would be is, in some cases, like what Kalia is saying, these people will never come and be involved in the plenary or designing anything. But we are then in a community building outreach standpoint of soliciting information, being in a listening mode, and then taking that information and feeding it into the work processes of the IDESG. So it may be having a focus group with a specific stakeholders group saying, tell us in your language what an identity issue is for you. And then someone, either from standards or someone who's doing use cases, who can translate that into usable language that would fit into whatever a work group process is doing. So there's different stages, what I'm saying, in the outreach. Sometimes the outreach isn't to get the people in the room, it's just to get the information in the room. And sometimes it is, how do you want to get involved? And that goes back to what Kalia said about the wiki is a great way for people who are in a technology industry and are used to using those formats, but maybe not so much from somebody who's my 89-year-old mother, member of AARP.
I'm going to interrupt priority queue for 1 second for a response from Scott.
In light of that, I do think that we should try to have some sort of outreach representatives who are IDESG members who can add things to the wiki on behalf of interviews, organizations, and so on.
Thank you, Scott. So Daza, and if anybody else wants to say something, put your hand up now, please. I think we do need to wrap this up in the next couple of minutes.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad this conversation went longer. I've got better insight now to the purpose of the use case gathering exercise. It sounds as though the intention is literally, and I think I've got some confirmation on this, as a way that people can express what IDESG should be doing. And so given that, I'd like to offer that this, while very useful, would best be only a part of how we would decide what we're doing. And another part would be a process for determining what those scenarios are and identifying which are the ones that are relevant to IDESG versus generally relevant to an identity ecosystem or use of identity in the market. And that would be something that we'd probably want to discuss in the plenary and have the plenary vote on. I think there's many different things that we could decide that would be useful, and there's more than one opinion on what we could be doing. I haven't really heard any opinions here that I wouldn't get behind. I'd like to know which one or two we're going to choose, and in that way, with a discussion explicitly on what we're doing, that is voted upon in the plenary ultimately after dialogue and debate and maybe back and forth, determine what it is we are doing, and not by a scattershot request of different use cases and functions a system could do, standards we could have, features a person might enjoy, every level of abstraction and context. It's good, and I think it's useful. We could maybe have an educational role where we share it out. It could inform some things. Not the process I would recommend to determine what we're doing. So let us use the plenary discussion to further crisp that idea and eventually have a vote in the plenary on what our priorities are for achieving our role under NSTIC.
Okay. So I think there was a broader suggestion there, but the more specific one to the use cases had really to do with criteria. And in my schedule, I had showed us trying to come up with the criteria, at least for the first set of use cases, over the next month. What I heard you say is you'd prefer to have that, even the selection of the criteria for these cases done by the plenary. Did you mean that you would want to wait until May to do that, or are you talking about doing electronically, or?
I'd say iteratively starting now, and ultimately I think it would be decided. I think May would be about a good time to at least do a simple decision. But I think we need to get the options on the table now, let people see what the universe is, and start that right now. That's right. Yes, I think iteratively decided between now and May. I think voting in May makes sense, but need to start a process to get the options on the table now, allow electronic dialogue, committees, and so forth. And now would be the time to begin crisping that up. Okay. And then at least we'll know the universe of things that we're relating use cases in all of our work to.
So in just a second, I'm going to have Brett make one more comment, and then we will take about a 15-minute break. Kathy, did you want to respond to that first?
I just did. I was just going to say that, I heard earlier, we want to accelerate this use cases. What I just heard Daza says is, let's stretch it out a little bit further. And so I do have a little bit of a balancing act to do there. And I did want to mention that I really appreciate all the ideas that you guys have for getting use cases from various communities. And I just challenge you to follow through on those and actually go out and try to help us gather those. Brett?
So this was what I was trying to touch on earlier about the scope and the role of the Standards Committee in this exercise. So let me be more precise, and maybe we should revisit the charter before we adopt it, just to make sure this is crystal clear. I think what the Standards Committee is doing, in addition to the standard-specific work they're doing, by taking on the use case stewardship responsibility, it is kind of an additional service to the plenary. But I don't see any role in one committee deciding what use cases are in or out. Mm-hmm. I see a collection. Okay, what do people think the priority is? Here's your score. Here they all are. Because what's consequential about this anyways? It's going to feed the work of other committees, mm-hmm. right? They're going to have deliverables, and they'll come back to this repository and pick the use cases that best help them achieve their deliverables. Does that make sense?
Thank you. It does. And in fact, we did take on the stewardship role initially because as we were looking at our job in adopting standards, that's a meaningless statement without a context. And so what is that context? We recognize that our job had a direct dependency on the use cases, on the functional models. So that's why we wound up moving forward with it in the first place. But we recognize that all the rest of your work has that same dependency, and so we're not intending to be the gatekeeper there. We're hoping to get as much interaction, and so I alluded to a slide that I didn't put up on a larger process, but I'd be glad to work with the Management Council or Bob at the plenary to refine that to make sure that we're doing what you just said.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathy. We've gone a little long here, but I think this is a really important discussion, and I think I'm really happy that we had the discussion at the length that we did. I think it clarifies some organizational issues and also some issues of how we're going to go forward and select what items to work on. So thanks, everybody, for having the discussion. It doesn't endanger our agenda because, as I said, the next session will be shorter than it's advertised in the agenda. So for now, I will declare us on break. Let's return at 10 minutes till 11 Mountain Standard Time. That is in about 10 minutes. And I'll see you back here then.